in order to be able to listen to what he's got in store for us. But let me first welcome everyone who's online, who's joined this call, this webinar. This is our second WBS Leadership Dialogues. As I indicated right at the beginning when we started these sessions, that these sessions are aimed at tackling major issues in our country, in the continent, in the world, and then look at them from a problem-solving approach, a mindset that is saying, if we know the problem, how are we going to solve it? And also the emphasis would be on implementation. So I've got a panel of speakers here, highly esteemed. We're going to look at the COVID, the impact it had on our economy. We know that COVID was disastrous for our South African economy, for our African economy, but for the whole world. We're not the only one in this pandemic. This is one pandemic that has actually impacted every aspect of our lives: economic, social, personal, family, everything. But the devastation on the economy has been unbelievable. So today, what we're going to be doing is to say, well, even before we went into the COVID and pandemic and a lockdown, our economy was already limping quite seriously. And now it's been devastated. Now the government needs to spend a lot of money on the rollout of the vaccine. And we are in a very difficult, challenging situation in terms of unemployment. It's skyrocketing, poverty rates are also skyrocketing. So we've got a big challenge in our country, and we need to find solutions. And hopefully the team that we have here, the panelists, are going to help us with the solutions. And as I want to repeat, this is just not a talk shop again. We're recording this. We're going to produce some articles, and we're going to make sure that the decision makers and the policy formulators have got this information coming out here. And this is very important. So thank you for coming. Let me introduce our team. We've got Dr. Lumkile Mondi. He's a lecturer in economics and School of Economics and Finance at Wits University. We've agreed we're not going to waste time with reading a CV. We all know Lumkile. The only thing you don't know, which I've discovered as I was looking at his resume, is that his second name is Patriarch. You better don't use that name too much, Lumkile. Otherwise, in this country, you will be in trouble. That you're promoting patriarchy. Hey, I laugh. And then we've got Martin Kingston. He doesn't need any further introduction. He's an executive chairman of Rothschild, and he's been a leader in this country in business, vice president of BUSA. I've worked with Martin in the energy sector in the BUSA subcommittee, and he's been the chair of the steering committee for BUSA SA COVID-19. So he's got understanding what was happening on COVID-19 from the business point of view. So he's going to be able to help us. I also like to tell you probably what you don't know. His middle name is Lawrence. So it's great to know you. Great to have you, Martin, here. And then Babu Nene, well-known figure in the public space in our country. He's been a former finance minister, but he's been a public servant for many, many years. And now he's, if his first name is Nhlanhla, he's also a professor here at Wits. So we are very proud here at Wits to have Professor Nhlanhla, and his middle name fascinated me, Musa. Those who do not understand Musa, it means Messi. Not Messi, Lionel Messi, but Messi. He's a non-executive director of Grow Bank, but we need to congratulate him today. Yesterday it was announced he was appointed the chairman of Tebe Investment Corporation. I think he deserves a round of applause for that. And he's really taking over from Vusi Kanyile, who's been a real stalwart and a leader in our country. Right, I think I'm not gonna waste any more time. Let's tell you what we're gonna be doing, how the whole thing is gonna run. Lumkile is gonna start, and we've agreed that we're not gonna be official here, be using titles. We'll just use our first name and make it an informal conversation. Lumkile will start at 10 minutes, followed by Martin, 10 minutes, and then from there, and Klanhla, 10 minutes. And then from there, you can start writing your questions on the chat box. Jane is going to collate them, send them to me, and send them to the speakers, the panelists. And then from there, we will have a very engaging session. So without any further waste of time, Lumkile is out there in some area outside, so he's stuck somewhere, but he's going to be able. Hopefully, the connectivity is not going to cause us any challenge. So, Lumkile, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Can you hear me? Am I loud and clear?
We can hear you very well.
Thank you so much. So, South Africa never seems to surprise us as South Africans and the world. South Africa, some of you who are my age will remember that in 1985, there were huge expectations from then President Botha that he was about to cross the Rubicon and release Nelson Mandela and all other political prisoners. And in fact, the call for him to release Nelson Mandela was informed by the sanctions that South Africa had experienced, by huge capital outflow as a result of apartheid, but more importantly, shrinking government finances due to South Africa's war effort in Namibia and Angola, as well as in the townships. So today, where we find ourselves is that South Africa does it again. It does it very, very differently. It does it by embarking on what was referred to as radical economic transformation, where SOEs or state-owned enterprises were centers of or engine of economic development. And we know today through the Zondo Commission what has happened to South Africa's fiscal space. So where we are today is that South Africa has reached a very high levels of debt in relation to its GDP. Maurice mentioned the high levels of unemployment, but really the most frustrating thing about South Africa is the fact that in a black-led government, we've seen poverty, which at least earlier on seems to be shrinking to about 44% in 2015. Now it's gone above 50%. We see also that inequality in South Africa has widened, and therefore in a position where the National Treasury finds itself at the same position as it was in the period under Botha. What is to be done? And at the center of it is an agreement between the Treasury and the Presidency through what we refer to as Operation Vulindlela. Operation Vulindlela is centered upon structural economic reforms, which the President articulated, later the Minister of Finance articulated as well in the budget. And really what we see in the budget is what many of my colleagues in the school of inequality, Southern Center for Inequality in Africa, my colleagues, Michael Sachs, argues very strongly, and many others, Dumako Bule and many other scholars of the left, argue that this is an austerity budget. And it's an austerity budget because in a pandemic, we're cutting salaries of public sector, particularly those of key personnel in the health sector and some in the education sector, where South Africa is most vulnerable during the pandemic, but also because we want to drive South Africa into a new form of industrial formation through innovation. Therefore, those two areas have been hit very, very hard. Similarly, with South Africa's high social wage, we have also cut tremendously with only nominal increases coming through, whether it's all pension or is the social grants that we provide for foster parents, but also for child-headed households, as well as children that have got offsprings. So what do we do when we find ourselves in this crisis that we have seen before? As I've said, several reforms have been announced. We know that in the energy sector, there's a big drive around procuring an additional just under 2,000 of power which the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy refers to as an emergency procurement, including huge gas power stations, which will all be floating on the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. So really what we find ourselves is a commitment of trying to do something good about a bad situation that South Africa found itself in. At the same time, what we're also seeing as South Africans is a huge drive on a private sector-led investment and economic recovery program. My colleague Martin Kingston will talk more about it. But what I want to leave you with is that South Africa has got no choice. Given the state weakness that we've seen in terms of the deployment of its own infrastructure program under the radical economic transformation, which went to people's pockets, others to the Gupta family and everywhere else in the world due to state capture that we saw. Now it's time for us to look whether we can take risk on the private sector and whether private sector can come to the party. So this is a huge responsibility in private sector. I'm leaving it to Martin to talk more about those initiatives. But on the government side, really, not only is it important for us to marshal the private sector to drive our investment drive, we also need to do more to acquire skills, to capacitate the state, which has been hollowed out across many institutions, from SOEs all the way to many institutions that interact with people where service delivery does not get to people. And it is that call that I expect through Operation Vulindlela that the deployment committee of the ruling party will stay away of intervening to deploy its own cadres, but really source in from institutions like us, where we produce at the business school some of the best highly trained intellectuals who can really be hard at work and accessible to government. But more important also is to mobilize also our endowment, which is found in wide skills. In South Africa, it's very rare to find many wide skills going to government because of the position the government is taking. I think it is time that we also source in there that skill that is everywhere, that is not employed by government due to our policies of affirmative action. So I think I've laid out what I wanted to say initially, and the rest I think will come through my colleagues. Let me leave it there, Maurice, so that other colleagues can come in, and then we can have a holistic discussion with some of the participants in this gathering tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lumkile. Thank you very much. You've outlined the problem and you've outlined where it started and where we are now. Thank you for your suggestions. I think let's move on to Martin. Martin, please go ahead. Martin, you're muted.
No, I was muted by the host. That would be you, okay. Maurice. So good afternoon to you.
I don't touch the technology. It's just Jason must have muted you.
And okay, all of the listeners, I'm sure you can hear me well. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. Lumkile has set the scene very well, and what I would like to do, if I may, Maurice, is take everybody on a little bit of a journey, going back a year in terms of what business has done, and particularly business for South Africa, which was formed really at the very onset of the pandemic, before we went into lockdown, when BUSA, alongside the BBC, realized that we needed to have an agile and comprehensive platform that could intervene alongside and in support of the national effort to combat the pandemic, particularly, as you say, Maurice, against a very dismal backdrop. We had just been effectively relegated, or we were about to be relegated to junk status. We were already in a recession before we went into lockdown and indeed the pandemic, which exacerbated all of those factors. And Business for South Africa, which emerged as a result of that, and whose steering committee I oversee, had three primary aims. One was to put in place healthcare interventions. If we cast our mind back, we'll remember that a year ago, it was impossible to get PPE in South Africa. So we set about assembling the capability to bring it in from abroad. The second was a labor market intervention group. And many of you, again, will have read about the need to provide support to those who've been rendered unemployed, particularly through the COVID UIF TERS facility. And the third was an economic intervention group, which was tasked not only with seeing how we could manage different levels of lockdown and engage with government in that context, but also to craft an accelerated economic recovery plan, which I'll talk about in a moment, so that when we come out of lockdown and when we come out of the pandemic, we would be able to do so on the front foot, recognizing all of our challenges. At the same time, we need to recognize that there were major challenges in the context of broader cooperation and collaboration among social partners. And it was our contention, and I believe that absolutely, that the only way that we're going to be able to navigate our way through these very difficult circumstances is by harnessing the resources, skills, and experience of all social partners, of government, of labor, of civil society, and indeed of the business community. And when I talk about the business community, I'm not talking about big business, I'm talking about all business, from the very largest multinationals to the very smallest micro enterprises in the formal and informal sector, domestic and international, across all sectors of the economy, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to get onto a sustainable and inclusive growth path. Now, at the same time, and we will hear again this evening what the president has to disclose to us about moving up a level. In fact, we as business have recommended that we should move from level 1 to level 2 or adjusted level 3. There's no difference effectively between level 2 and adjusted level 3, curtailing the amount of congregating that people can do, extending the hours when people need to stay at home, so extending curfew, because we know, of course, that movement, proximity to other people, of course, does nothing but accelerate the transmission of the virus in an environment where we have, of course, seen an unprecedented level of both infection and death so far, and we're threatened with the prospect of a third wave and potentially even a third variant at the very time where we're trying to roll out the vaccine program. And I'm sure that many people would want to hear about that. And I believe, by the way, Maurice, that the vaccine program, although it's not a silver bullet, is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet. If there's only one economic intervention that this country can make, it is to implement a comprehensive and broad vaccine program as quickly as possible. It has the most significant impact upon economic outcomes in the short, medium, and the longer term. Nevertheless, the focus of Business for South Africa, and we engaged very directly through NEDLAC and with the economic cluster of ministers, was to craft an economic recovery plan. And I'd like to emphasize an accelerated economic recovery plan. We have a multiplicity of plans in this country. We are, as you've said at the very outset, extremely poor at implementation, particularly, but not only, I have to say, in the private sector. And we needed to work out how we could actually harness those resources that I was talking about to focus on a limited number of interventions in the short term, and then look at broader structural reforms in the medium and the longer term. In the final analysis, I think we all understand that it is investment that spurs growth, and it is growth that creates sustainable jobs. And investment only happens, and primarily it is the private sector, large and small, that drives investment, if there's adequate confidence in the economic environment and the broader socioeconomy in which we are investing. And there have been a number of warning signals over the past several years, which as a country we haven't taken adequate cognizance of. The level of criminality and corruption, both in the public and indeed in the private sector, completely unacceptable, hasn't been controlled, hasn't been addressed. I'm sure we all continue to be horrified by the disclosures and revelations that are made on a daily basis at Zondo. We need to deal with that. The need to have a clearly identified set of policies that are aligned and internally consistent, which means that people can invest with certainty and indeed with confidence that the rules of the game are not going to be changed. Obviously, investors want investor-friendly policies, but any policy that is consistent is better than one that unfortunately may be dynamic in its application, recognizing, of course, that we need to amend and adapt as circumstances require. The third was to identify low-hanging fruit, items that could be addressed in the here and now that would move the needle meaningfully. And as business, we identified a number of them. They've been identified by almost every single provider of capital, every rating agency, by the international agencies such as the IMF and the World Bank, be that visa reform, be that the restructuring of the energy sector, including, of course, ESCOM within that context, ensuring that we have much higher levels of productivity in the country as a whole and that people are held to account accordingly, making sure that we opened up and auctioned spectrum so that we could migrate to a much faster and a much more IT-based 4IR economy than we've been able to date. And of course, what the pandemic has done is this has brought into sharp relief the need to ensure that the challenges, the pernicious challenges, I have to say, of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, all of which have been exacerbated as a consequence of the pandemic, are addressed decisively once and for all, and are addressed in partnership by business, government, labor, and civil society more broadly, ensuring that we don't duplicate or replicate work that has already been done or can be done more effectively by one party by another. And Operation Vulindlela, that has been talked about by Lumkile, is one such example. We have already seconded resources into Vulindlela, particularly, but not only around infrastructure. We all know that infrastructure, provided that it is viable and sustainable, is a key driver of long-term economic output, let alone in the immediate short term with the creation of jobs. But I need to emphasize that it needs to be viable and sustainable. We tabled our accelerated economic recovery strategy to the president in the middle of July last year. It's shocking to think that that's now 9 months ago. We'd just come out of hard lockdown and then through the levels to approximately level 3 when we tabled the accelerated economic recovery plan. And out of that was born in part the reconstruction and recovery plan of governments, although again, we had to wrestle that back to make sure that we limited our focus on a number of key priorities that could move the needle and address the issues that were beginning to emerge, as I've indicated. And some of those key challenges, such as the increase in unemployment, the increase in poverty to unprecedented levels, both narrow and broad unemployment, and particularly concerning youth unemployment. 2 million people lost their jobs last year in the informal and the formal sector. Some 600,000 people are coming out of school into the job market every year, the vast majority of whom will not find sustainable jobs unless we change the construct of our economy. And really to crown all of this, Maurice, is the fiscal constraints that we find ourselves in as a country. Limited fiscal maneuverability, every cent and every rand counts. We need to make sure that it is earmarked appropriately. And therefore the budget that the Minister of Finance tabled last month, which met with support from some quarters, but a lot of criticism from others, by definition was not going to satisfy all comers. But we're a country that cannot afford to borrow more. The amount of revenue that now goes by way of expenditure, national expenditure, to servicing that debt is completely unsustainable again for the longer term. We need to deal with that. We at the same time need to ensure that we are accountable, both in the public and the private sector, that there is transparency, full visibility and accountability. That's been the hallmark of our approach, for example, as business to the vaccine strategy. There's high levels of both frustration and anxiety that there isn't the clarity and visibility that is required. It's all about transparency, credibility, and accountability in the final analysis. And the last area that I would like to talk about before I hand over to Professor Nene is the need for structural reform in the medium and indeed in the longer term. In many sectors of our economy, the role of the public sector, Lumkile mentioned cadre deployment. We need to talk about that honestly and openly as a society. It just cannot be the case that for every board of an SOE, every senior executive position, that it is subject to the decision-making processes of the African National Congress or indeed of any other party. The individuals concerned must be selected on the basis of competence, integrity, and merit, rather than on the basis of any politically biased or orientated criteria. By the same token, the role of state-owned enterprises is absolutely fundamental. We need to determine which of them are important in the context of sustaining economic activity and which of them are not. And those that we retain on the state balance sheet need to be rendered fit for purpose. They need to have appropriate strategies that are capable of being implemented by a competent and capable management, as I said, recruited on their merits and overseen by boards that are independent, and by independent, I mean independent of political or any other influence. They should be accountable to the nation as a whole, as state-owned enterprises. And then those public sector enterprises, those state-owned enterprises, need to be suitably capitalized so that they can give effect to those fit-for-purpose strategies. Now, we know that with the likes of Eskom and Transnet, that presents very significant challenges. And once again, we need to determine to what extent it is necessary for all of the activities, indeed of an Eskom or a Transnet, to be housed within the public sector as opposed to migrated to the private sector. I must say that it has been a matter of some concern and frustration that the low-hanging fruit that I characterized earlier on, identified in July last year, has not yet been picked. Whether that was auction of spectrum or the release of the subsequent fourth and fifth windows of IPPs, or whether it was ensuring that visas, not only for travelers, but also specialist skills visas, would be reformed and addressed. All of that could have been done at an accelerated pace and would have sent a signal to the market. And by the market, I mean providers of capital, both domestically and internationally, that the requisite decisions were being taken with courage and confidence in order that we could start to move forward. We've identified within the structures of the Economic Recovery Action Plan 4 areas of immediate focus. That is the energy sector, the need for localization and industrialization again, wherever viable and practically possible. The rehabilitation of transportation on the same basis, particularly port and rail and road. That's a subset, of course, of infrastructure. And ensuring that we have an environment that enables SMMEs to grow and be sustained in a very difficult set of circumstances. And we need to assume that that set of circumstances is going to be with us certainly for the next 1 or 2 years. 2 final points, if I may. The first is that our current modeling would suggest, and I think that this is now consensus, that recognizing the 7% contraction that we experienced in 2020 in GDP, by the way, a much lower level of contraction than in our worst case scenario, it's going to take us between 3 and 4 years to return to pre-COVID levels of real GDP. Now, by the way, we were in a recession then, so that's again inadequate. And that 3 to 4 years is predicated upon us implementing the structural reforms that I referred to before. In the case of employment, it's going to take us between 10 and 11 years, acknowledging the new joiners coming onto the market, to get to the levels of narrow and broad unemployment that we found again pre-COVID a year ago. both of them unacceptable statistics in the South African environment. The light at the end of the tunnel for me, Maurice, is that we have found an ability to harness resources, not just across business, but to work in a cooperative and collaborative manner between business and the state, and indeed with our social partners, that in my experience has been unprecedented, certainly for the last 20 years. Maybe at the dawn of democracy, there was a level of goodwill that hasn't existed thereafter. We need to make sure that we can build on that impetus, particularly, but not only, in the implementation of the vaccination program, which, as I said, is the most important single economic intervention open to us. And if we can project both domestically and internationally that we have a significant level of alignment, that we're able to focus our resources on a limited number of key interventions, then I believe that we'll be able to achieve some of the potential that has been within our grasp, but not taken advantage of over the past several years. And with that, I will hand over, if I may, Maurice, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. Very comprehensive journey that you have taken us through as a leader of the Business for South Africa, and very important points you've made about social cohesion there and the low-hanging fruit. I've seen a question that says, well, why are we not picking these long-hanging fruit? But we'll come back to that. Let's move on to Professor Nene and Nhlanhla Nene. Over to you, Baba.
Thank you very much, Pumane, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important discussion on looking at the challenges, but more the opportunities posed by COVID-19. It's very difficult to speak after the two esteemed panelists that have just spoken. This might either make my job very easy because I'll say everything has been said. Let's proceed. But also difficult in that if there are any gaps, they have left me with very, very few gaps, which I just need to find. Speaking to one of my friends about the situation, he actually drew an analogy of what we are confronted with the pandemic. He says, this is like a familiar picture of a long lost relative who arrives at your doorstep without any forewarning. Then you assume he is just passing through. Weeks in, the guest has grown very comfortable. He empties the fridge, generally causing havoc in the house. One of the things that usually happen in a situation like this is that tensions within the household that have been there, perhaps simmering for decades, they become more visible. Now, though this is no relative in the common usage of the word, COVID-19 has actually done that to our country. When it struck early last year and government imposed the lockdown, most of us assumed it would pass soon. But here we are a year later, and there is talk of a third wave, and the fact that unwelcome guests will be with us for a lot longer is much more starker. We talk about whether this is going to be a V-shaped crisis, whether it's going to be U-shaped, whether it's going to be W-shaped. Fact of the matter is that it seems like it's going to be with us for quite long. Now, like that relative that I spoke about, it has left a trail of destruction. We've had Martin and Lungile say this, but it has merely worsened our economic performance, destroying millions of jobs and forcing many businesses to close shop. But what do we learn from the survey of the damage? And we've had Martin outlining the journey. It is simply that the South African economic house wasn't resting, and Lungile mentioned this. It wasn't on firm foundations anyway when this struck. This we knew pre-COVID-19. And now we knew that we were amongst the most unequal societies on earth. Of course, Lungile says that those inequalities have now widened but not only in terms of income and wealth, but also in terms of access to opportunities. High quality education, access to high quality education, access to jobs, access to decent living conditions, and transport and all other amenities. Now, we've seen unemployment hitting the highest levels ever, above 30%, even the narrow definition would reveal. Now, it bears repeating that, Africans, for reasons of history, bear the heaviest burden of all of these ills. Now, we know that long before COVID visited us, we'd been talking about these fissures in our society, even long before the end of the apartheid and the ushering in of our democratic dispensation in the early 90s. Now, on many occasions, we've had sufficient consensus like we do now on what has to be done to fix them. Now, the question is, what has made such progress? And you hear questions about why aren't we picking up the low-hanging fruit in order to fix our socio-economic structural flaws? Now, somebody says that the answer to this question, which is actually common knowledge, says there are just 5 stumbling blocks. And all of those stumbling blocks start with a P. And those stumbling blocks, Martin also alluded to this in a way. The first P is politics. The second P is politics. The third P is politics. And the fourth one is politics. And so is the fifth one. So now all these things that must be done to raise economic growth, Maurice and the audience, to a level that is high enough for South Africa to address its key problems of unemployment and poverty, are common knowledge. They have been exhaustively discussed over many years now. We've produced document after document. We've produced plans after plan. All of them talk directly to what it is that needs to be done in order to address these things. Now, if I told you that South Africa must do structural reforms, and I've heard this repeated again, I would sound like a scratched record. I know young people won't know what I'm talking about when I talk about a scratched record. And perhaps you'll have to Google it to know what it used to look like. Now, structural reform can be likened to a road on which economic actors drive, ladies and gentlemen. When the road is narrow, full of sharp bends and narrow bridges, economic players can only drive very slowly. But when you widen the road, a multiple lane highway, smoothing the bends and widening the bridges, traffic begins to flow more smoothly and faster. And that's what I think the structural reforms we're talking about and that Martin spoke of. And we call them low-hanging fruits because I would imagine they can be picked. So what has stopped us from widening the road? Well, I did say these 5 Ps all end up in one word. The reason is simply that, in my view, economic reforms create winners and losers. And secondly, that economic reforms often take time to bear fruit. And at times, they come with unintended consequences. And those who stand to lose will mobilize and block the reforms. Often those who stand to gain are not a political bloc in the sense that they can't mobilize themselves to push for reforms that would benefit them. An example is that, unemployed people do not have a movement of their own or a trade union or even a federation as others would have of those that are employed, which means that they can't articulate their demands in the political marketplace. So they will always remain outside because no one represents their aspirations and their views. Now, we are not unique as a country in this regard. All countries developed and developing struggle with the implementation of economic reforms, especially the kind that takes a long time to implement. Now, to be implemented sustainably over a long period of time and making necessary adjustments along the way, economic reforms require political will and political management. Now, the solution to our challenges, slow pace of economic growth, is indeed, I would repeat, political. Until we find a solution to this political problem, which is a movie playing out, we've seen the movie that's playing out there daily, we won't make such sustainable progress in addressing the key challenges. Now, Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the economic reforms do need to be unpacked from time to time so that we remind ourselves. And this has been mentioned by both Lumkile and Martin. Well, where we talk about the speed and the agency with which we should actually address our energy challenge. The release of the spectrum in whatever form, be it auction or whatever. And as we were saying earlier, that the fact that COVID has actually brought to light the importance of technology in us, like we are having this conversation today. These webinars, Maurice, would not have been used the way we are using them today, and all sorts of other communication mechanisms that we use in order to be able to have meetings. I would take 1.5 days to travel to Amsterdam for a supervisory board meeting, which now I'm able to do sitting here at the farm. And if only we were to have this broadband and were to have the technology and the infrastructure that allows us, that we do this without panic, that we might actually just be cut off, or that there might actually just, the traffic might be so much that we would not be able to execute this one. So the release of the spectrum is actually critical. Removing red tape and that inhibits, especially SME development and entrepreneurial performance. And also a social compact to lower the cost of living, because for that to succeed, we do need a social compact, because some people, as I said, would not want to be displaced. Lower the cost of living and the cost of doing business simultaneously, but also identify the industries that need support in order to be able to provide the employment we need and sustainable livelihoods. As somebody has also mentioned, I think it was Martin who said that we also operate in a situation, and Lungile did mention that, in a situation where government doesn't have the financial muscle to be able to deliver on all of these things. If we look at the current budget that we have just seen, the bulk of our spending is actually in the social services and leaving very little for investment. And that does pose a big challenge. And indeed, as Lungile did mention, that forces us into an austerity space when we actually need resources in order to be able to dig ourselves out of the crisis. So, it only takes a crisis also to mobilize people to actually find a solution. And I think we should not let this crisis and this pandemic go to waste. This is an opportunity where we need to work together to dig ourselves out of a crisis situation. And I think South Africa has got the wherewithal, and we just need to be able to actually stand up and agree that the 5 Ps I spoke about do not stand in the way of us achieving the true liberation of our poor people on the ground. With that, as I said, I wouldn't want to go deeper and undo what the 2 esteemed panelists have done. Allow me to pause here. Thanks, Maurice.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's a really good analysis. I'm going to fire up with questions. I mean, let's start with you right there, because you've used the word politics 5 times. And I'm going to put you on the spot here. We've just seen over this last weekend, even yesterday, that the factional battles in our ruling party are manifesting itself and are actually getting very rough now. To what extent is that going to hamper our economic recovery plan?
Look, again, as I said, the sad part is that when that happens, we take a few steps back and only 1 step going forward. And I think it is time that perhaps it does take, as they always say, that there is no omelette without breaking an egg. Perhaps it does take a situation of this nature to reach a level where everybody realizes that I think it is time now, to soldier on no matter how difficult it is, because some of these things should have happened a long time ago, but they haven't happened because we've actually been walking and feeling the stones all the time. Perhaps it's time that some of these things happened. And, South Africans have seen the worst, if I were to say so. And if this is also a moment of reckoning for South Africans, I think we do need to really put all the 5 Ps aside and focus on rebuilding our country and our economy.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me go back to Lumkile. Lumkile, you said we are in a crossroad. We are in the time of PW Botha, and he failed to cross the Rubicon. Do you sense that we're going to fail to cross the Rubicon, or we're going to have the will to cross the Rubicon?
I think we crossed the Rubicon in 1994.
I'm talking about our Rubicon now.
Our Rubicon, it was crossed in 1994 when we had national liberation. And in fact, the governing party's mission was national liberation. So it was never ready to govern, nor will it be ever to govern.
Yeah.
So South Africa is going to be crawling, as we saw during apartheid, when our potential GDP growth, because of underutilization of black resources, were trapped in the Bantustans, was about 3%. So I think the recovery that Martin talked about is because of a low base that we're coming from of about -7%. So we may see about 3% this year, but from a low base. I don't think that South Africa under the ANC will likely be a vibrant emerging market. I think the politics that Professor Ren was talking to will remain a constraint and take away all the potential economic growth that we face. So I think it's about time that all of us accept that the ruling party was a national liberation movement and has served its purpose. It's been given over 26 years and it's put us in a worse position that reminded us of the apartheid regime under Botha. So I don't see much really coming out. I think it is up to us, the citizens, to defend our democracy, to reclaim our economy by making better decisions when you vote in the coming local government election and the national elections in about 2.5 years.
Okay, Lumkile. Martin, you spoke about low-hanging fruit. They've been one of the questions here. I know the person who's is Professor Yanni said that I heard a remark about low-hanging fruit. When will the low-hanging fruit start rotting because we do not harvest such fruit? And what is stopping us from really picking them up? Yeah. Unmute, Martin. Somebody's muted, Martin, please. Rotendo Jayton.
There we go.
Okay,
You've got a very aggressive muter on your team, I'm afraid. But I enjoyed talking to myself just now. It was very, very entertaining. So let's talk about these low-hanging fruit, and I'd like to incorporate both what Lumkile said and before that, Klankla's point about politics. So we identified 11 low-hanging fruits, and these are all theoretically decisions that can be taken relatively easily. I'm putting the politics to one side, and can generate real economic activity. And the first, and we've mentioned this already, is self-generation projects and affordable generation, which is within reach at the moment, and yet is still mired in the politics of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy and the interface between themselves and the regulator, NERSA. The second is improvement of port efficiencies. Our ports are some of the most inefficient ports in the world, with no good reason for that to be the case. As I said at the outset, we need to radically ramp up on productivity. The third was that there was a commitment last year for digital migration by December the 21st, and the spectrum release, we know that's now not going to happen. It's the subject of court cases because we don't have regulations or draft regulations that meet the necessary support. I talked about the need for clarification on the visa regime. Now, it may well be that in the current COVID environment, tourism is not a major driver of the economy, but we know that in a post-pandemic environment, it's a key generator, both of foreign exchange, of economic activity, and most importantly, of jobs on a very large and extended scale. We have to deal with the issue of corruption, and we have to hold people accountable. We know that the wheels of justice turn slowly, but there's turning slowly and not turning at all. It's a huge disincentive for people to mobilize capital if we don't see that corruption and criminality is addressed, and it's addressed head on. And again, we can see that it is part and parcel of the challenge that is facing our political economy right now. I had talked about the need for critical skills and dealing with license and permit requirements. Again, an easy thing to address. I want to spend a moment talking about building a capable state, because for all the comments that I've seen, none of these initiatives can be implemented, Maurice, if we don't have a competent, capable, transparent, and accountable state. And I would argue we don't. And if and to the extent we need to mobilize resources from elsewhere, then I think what we've demonstrated over the past 12 months is that we can harness those resources from all social partners, including, by the way, from academia. There's no reason why it cannot be drawn from wherever the competence, capability, and relevant experience resides. And this capable state doesn't just relate to government at national and provincial, or indeed most particularly at local level. And we've all read, I think with horror, the Auditor General's most recent report. And every year we've seen an increasing and progressively serious set of issues emerging from the Auditor General's report. But the need to take decisions, for example, around SOEs. Now, when in fact Professor Nene was the Minister of Finance, I had the good fortune and he had the bad fortune to deal with one another in the context of SAA. SAA is now being supported by the public purse at a time when, in November of last year, we did not have the financial wherewithal to lay our hands on $17 million as a country to be able to put down the 15% deposit for the COVAX facility for 6 million South Africans to be vaccinated. Now, if we can't find $17 million, I would suggest we've got a big problem on our hands. And when we see multiples of that going to SAA, which is moribund, which is grounded, and when there's no realistic prospect in the short term to see it reach any type of viability, we need to realize that it is about taking difficult decisions, grasping the nettle, and being prepared to prioritize our key objectives accordingly. Because we are indeed otherwise going to see that we are fiddling as a country whilst Rome burns. And it's not as though it is a one-for-one relationship. As Lumkile said, when we contract by 7% and we then rebound by 3%, that is 3% off what is 93% of a pre-COVID level of economic activity, which, as I said before, was one which was in recession before we'd been downgraded to sub-investment grade status. Now, each and every one of the interventions that I've talked about, we believe could be done within 6 months. That doesn't mean we can complete them. It means that we can get the show on the road for each and every one of these. We can demonstrate a route map, which is credible, and where we deliver against commitments, where we're held to account as society, as partners in that process. My fear is that if we do not do that, then such confidence as exists, and we've got almost historically low levels of confidence, will continue to erode. And rather like an economic recovery, we're going to find that it's going to take much longer to get back to where we were than it took to slide down the hill in the first place. So we're into a long-term process, but where we have to acknowledge, Maurice, that at the very outset, there are specific decisions that need to be taken. Frankly, I don't mind which they are, as long as they're taken and implemented, both taken and implemented in a visible manner that actually, as I said, inspires the requisite confidence. And then we can start to build the necessary momentum, recognizing, and I've noted some of the comments, that we have limited fiscal resources at our disposal. And if we're going to look at the reallocation of those resources, then once again, we need to acknowledge that there are some current recipients who are going to have to forego the benefits that they've achieved to date. Thanks, Maurice.
Thank you very much, Martin. Number of questions are coming through, but I just want to zero in on these low-hanging fruits, and we've mentioned them: it's self-generation, port inefficiencies, digital visa, well, corruption, and critical skills, and say most of these seem to be government. Government must make these decisions. It's almost like we've got a defeatist attitude and says it's government must do. My question to all of us, Lumkile, and then what can we do as business, as civil society, and as right now where I'm sitting in the business schools. What can the academia do to get things going? Any thought there, Nene?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maurice. I think that's an important question, because it does say that whenever we are on a discussion table, the attitude is more about what can the other party do rather than what it is that I can bring to the table, because that would make the discussion even easier to implement, because I would be committing to what I can bring to the table. As I said earlier, the difficulty is that the real so-called motive forces, the real beneficiaries of whatever could come out of a turned-around economy, do not have a voice. And unfortunately, they rely on government to represent them because it is elected by the people. But I think there is a lot that we could do wherever we are, the academia, the private sector, be it in business, but also the ordinary citizens, because we do need a way of digging ourselves out of the crisis. But what is required of the state is for the state to create an environment that is conducive to us doing that. And that is why I spoke of a social compact, which we've spoken of a long time. And we keep on talking about it, but there is very little action, because again, when we do sit around the table, be it a table where labor, business, and the state sit, labor will be pointing fingers at government, and business would be saying government needs to do X, Y, Z. And we would not be saying, as labor, these are the sacrifices we are prepared to make. Because in order for us to create an inclusive economic environment for unemployed people to join the labor force, we actually do need to see some sacrifices on the labor side. Same with government, because and the private sector, because we find that the private sector will always find it easy to invest in seeing that there are challenges with the labor issues. They will find it much easier to migrate towards mechanization and all sorts of other things, and building those skills rather than creating labor intensive job opportunities. So there is a lot we can do from wherever we sit, but I think there are sectors that need to be identified and incentives created in order for those sectors where there would be more employment created. One of those spaces, be it agriculture, where I know that with agriculture, given the necessary support, agriculture can turn things around because it addresses three challenges at the same time. It addresses food security, which is a critical area in terms of poverty. It addresses employment for people of low skills, but at the same time, it generates the economic activity that the country needs so dearly. So it is important to identify those areas, and in those areas to begin to stand up and begin to do things in a manner and work together with the state in order to promote some of those sectors. We spoke about energy generation, and it's another area. Without energy, we are not. There's an argument that has just come up that in 2010 our energy demand was lower than the demand now, and therefore this is an opportunity that we should be creating the energy that the country requires. Because the demand is actually not as high as it was back in 2010. And when the economy started performing back then, that's when it choked, because our energy infrastructure was not ready for this. So it's some of those key areas that need to be opened up and get more players coming in and making sure that we do not waste time on politics, but spend more time dirtying our hands and getting things done.
Good. There's a lot of questions around SOEs that are coming from the chat box here. I want to hear your view, Lumkile. There's a lot of discussion around questions around, obviously we've talked about SAA, SOE, the whole question of privatizing the SOEs. Will that be a silver bullet?
This was a huge study conducted between 2011 and 2015. The Presidential SOE Review Committee, which looked into the whole question of SOEs. And again, as I've been arguing this evening, that South Africa's problems are political. They manifest them economically, but they're political. So the idea that you could simply deploy a Lumkile Mondi who has no capability, deployed just to manipulate Lumkile, if there's tender or procurement that comes out of the SOE, that tender goes elsewhere to those that are favored, is a huge weakness in our system. So I think for me, in a country where we know today that politics matter, that SOEs, not only are they supposed to lower the cost of business, facilitate new industries because they can take the risk, given that there's a state that will support it from time to time, and therefore create capabilities. The South African case is baffling because in the apartheid era, they did that so exceptionally well. In the post-apartheid area, they've stopped being innovators and risk takers, but cash cows for those that are politically connected and those that's in power. So therefore, what has to be done in that environment? If we cannot be able to resolve the political question, it therefore means we must look at other institutions that can resolve that problem. And I think at this time of our history, private sector becomes a very viable option, given that it's got the resources, it's got the capabilities, and yet on the public sector, we've made the wrong choices, which I've just mentioned now, and have been subject of my talk the whole evening. So therefore, for me, the issue around privatization in South Africa is no longer an ideological matter, as many people put across. It is a practical matter because under the governing party, the SOEs are constrained as to what they can do economically. Therefore, perhaps we need to think bigger because we're not willing to resolve the political questions. So let's resolve the economic questions through a privatization process where we can be able to unlock value for the public and then use those resources to deploy in areas which are strategic, such as education, such as the health sector, and therefore get ourselves going using those proceeds on those SOEs that the state has just mismanaged. Thanks, Maurice.
Thank you very much. This topic about cadre deployment, I see my friend Martin Deakin all the way from the States also commenting there, micro and medium initiatives. This cadre deployment is a big issue, and it comes to this question of the capable state and the skills and competent people that needs to be there. Do you think there's a role for the academia and producing people that will go into that and run these state enterprises much more effectively and much more efficiently? I've been all over the world. I've been in the oil industry, and I'm surprised how state-owned enterprises in the Middle East are run. In Qatar, the place I used to visit Qatar Petroleum is the engine of the entire Qatar economic development, well run. So is there a role of how do you develop the skills, the capacity, and so that we can remove this cadre deployment question? Anyone want to venture into that?
Sorry, Maurice, let me come in. Sorry, I'm abusing my position.
Yeah.
So, Maurice, we're looking at Mr. Kaweni, who is running the government school. So I think there's a huge opportunity through Busani's institution in the government university, where us as Wits Business School and the main Wits University and others, of course, in the systems of innovation can play a critical role with Busani's school to really assist him in terms of skilling up the existing bureaucracy, but also bringing in some of our students through the government school. Because I think in Brazil, for example, if you're going to work for a Banco Nacional de Desenvolvimento Social, BNDES, the state development bank, you have to write exam, you have got to go through a rigorous process. I'm expecting that Busani, perhaps through our support and others, can be able to really start creating capabilities, a cadre that's not deployed by the political party, but comes from the university of government in partnership with us, and to create that capability and a state that can be capable to fulfill its constitutional mandate. So I do think that we need to bring maybe at some point Busani so that we can engage him on this, because I think it is possible to build capabilities, but it requires us all to support institutions in government, such as Busani's one, to really do the right thing and support government and make sure that we do create capabilities to implement. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning that, because 2 weekends ago, I was addressing the Department of Justice. I was surprised that there's actually a school within the Department of Justice, which is basically training capacity managers and everyone. And I said to them, I can't believe it, because I mean, the inefficiency that we find in the judiciary system, the fact that, somebody set a deadline and says the case is on this date, but it's going to be reminded 3 times before something happens. And so I think there's a role there where we can look at developing partnership with a lot of capacity building institutions. But let's move along. There's a question of entrepreneurship and micro initiatives and macro initiatives, particularly entrepreneurship. It looks like we are not spending enough time to create an environment for entrepreneurs that they have to go to the United States of America and do wonderful things there, and we just don't have our fair share of entrepreneurs that will generate the economic growth that we want. How can we tackle that problem? Any proposals there?
So let me, if I may, Maurice, start on that. There's no doubt that in any vibrant economy, it is not the state and it is not big business that is the flywheel for economic activity.
Yeah.
It's entrepreneurs on the one hand and small and medium-sized enterprises on the other hand. And of course, most entrepreneurs operate small and medium-sized enterprises. First of all, we need to ensure that they are appropriately skilled and capacitated. And I believe that we have plenty of capacity, including institutional capacity, to achieve that. And I fully endorse what Lumkile has said, which is that we should be harnessing the capabilities of the likes of the business school and other institutions of tertiary learning who can upskill those who are perhaps already at work but need greater skills. There's no lack of capacity, in my opinion, in academia to provide that support. But the second issue, and there are perhaps three I'm going to mention, is we need to create an environment that is appropriate for entrepreneurs to be able to do business. One of the reasons why we have identified SMMEs as a focal point is because they are throttled, asphyxiated, I should say, by red tape. That is not private sector red tape, it is public sector red tape. And it has been raised repeatedly. And the frustration and the challenge is that when we raise it, for example, with the president and his economic cluster, guess what? They agree. It's not new. There's nothing that we're discussing today that is new, but it requires political will or resolve and capacity to be able to ensure that those processes are addressed. Half of Project Vulindlela is about dealing with red tape and unnecessary licensing or regulatory requirements. And the third, because I don't think that we should let the private sector off the hook, is to ensure that there is the ability for entrepreneurs to access capital on appropriate terms and conditions. But in the final analysis, those propositions that are put in front of providers of capital, primarily, but not only banks, need to be viable. They need to be commercially viable. So at the very outset, those aspiring entrepreneurs need to be taught the skills and capabilities to assess the difference between what is viable and what is not viable. It's completely unrealistic. In fact, it is improper, immoral, in my opinion, and high risk to ask banks to lend money or investors to invest money in propositions that are not economically viable or sustainable. That has to be the starting point. And by the way, many of these transactions, situations, projects can be rendered appropriately viable. I want to make another point, if I may, Maurice. It's come up in some of the chat boxes, but we mustn't forget it, which is we're operating in a particularly unique set of circumstances currently, one that is not of our making, but we can't wish away. The pandemic is here to stay until such time as we have either have vaccinated the population in its entirety effectively, to the extent, by the way, to the extent that we've acquired herd immunity, and that's a long way away from where we are today, or we have to live within constrained circumstances, which by definition puts a further brake on economic activity. And I've seen comments that have already been made about the tourism industry. You know, many people are extremely concerned that we're seeing an industry that is not just in decline, but is being decimated, literally decimated, as a consequence of the pandemic and associated restrictions. I'm not expressing an opinion on whether those restrictions are appropriate or not. So we need to have some level of agility and dynamic flexibility as a country to respond to these circumstances. There's no point in taking the NDP off the shelf, which might have been fit for purpose 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, I have to say, I started quaking when I heard Lumkile talking about the SOE review that took place. It started over 10 years ago. None of those recommendations have been implemented, by the way. We've had the same ruling party that has been the government of the day over that entire period of time. It's completely inexplicable why it is that decisions that were perfectly sensible weren't implemented. So I have to say that in the context of entrepreneurs, it's the same thing. We need to be able to group the capabilities from the public, from the private sector, and from academia, including access to finance, to ensure that they can thrive, prosper, and indeed drive economic activity.
Thank you, Martin.
Maurice, if I could.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to what Martin has just said about entrepreneurial development, because, you know, entrepreneurs by their very nature are people that would want to operate in a free-range environment. People who do not want, you know, and that's why they are, you know, they've got a code name that we're called informal, you know, we're called the informal sector, because we want to operate in an environment where people are free to try things, to do things, some of them which may not succeed. And I don't think we should, you know, be apologetic about the failure of some of, you know, those ventures that people go into. All successful business people will tell you how, in the process they actually failed, but they would actually soldier on because they are looking for success at the end of the day. So an environment which Martin talks about that allows the entrepreneurs to be able to flourish is an environment that doesn't have red tape, and up to a certain limit, because you do not want a completely, you know, free for all, but up to a certain limit where people would actually be allowed up to certain thresholds to be able to actually range freely in order to be able to, you know,
I need a car permit for my car.
Yeah, Lumkile, yeah, okay. He operates in the informal sector as well. When he ranges freely, he's able to come in and out.
I'm going
But
to
you know, you spoke about people having to go, you know, to
I'm
the US.
Actually,
You know, when are we going to have our own Silicon Valleys? You know, I wouldn't say Silicon Valley in the true sense, but something where, you know, entrepreneurs would be able to go on a trial and error, do their things, have their staff registered in a manner that does not restrict them, but that allows them to be able to flourish. You know, again, going back to the area that I operate in the agriculture space. You know, small-scale farmers do not. A lot of people tend to think that small-scale farmers are not, you know, growing because they lack financing. I don't think that is entirely true. Of course, they do have a problem of financing, but I think the biggest challenge is lack of access to the market and market intelligence. Not being able to know when you have produced your wares, where you should take them to. So mobilizing small-scale farmers in a manner that begins to allow them space. And I've been in endless conversations with the local municipality in my area here to say to them, provide the small-scale farmers with a market where they will bring in their wares. And since some of us have got an interest in trying to bring the sellers and the buyers together, let those of us that have got that interest do that. But as long as the local municipality provides them with space to be able to do that, it's something that has actually taken a good 9 months now for the concept to even develop. And it's a simple concept. We're saying provide the facility, and in that facility, whoever are agents would be paying rent, and it's a win-win. But here are small-scale farmers who produce their stuff and end up not being able to just take it to the market in order for it to be sold and for them to survive out of it. So it's an environment that needs to be created for the informal sector to be able to flourish in an environment which is not as restrictive.
We're left with 10 minutes now. I want to give you an opportunity to scan the questions on the chat box. because there's just quite a number of them who is not being able to read them and then ask you them. So I want to give each one of you now the next 3 minutes. We must not have the goal to be fair in this crisis. This is weekend, is the local tourist get this. Martin is firing from all cylinders from the US. It's Martin Deacon, not you, Martin.
Yes, no, I see that.
Yeah. What I want to give you is 3 minutes each. Or in your concluding statement, in our closing comments, look at the questions there, see which ones you want to pick, and then give us your final concluding comments. I don't know whether Lumkile were able to see the questions, but you can just give us your concluding comments, given the fact that we want to close sharp at 5:30. Lumkile.
So one of the comments come from Comrade Neil Coleman. Basically, which I concur with, is that South Africa needs to think just beyond some of the suggestions that we've discussed this evening, that there is a problem with our macroeconomic policy as well.
We've lost you there, Lumkile.
Sorry, Maurice, I got disturbed by some people passing behind me. So the issue around macroeconomic policy becomes very critical. And therefore, we need to go beyond the treasury point of view and look at other ways. For example, last week, the School of Government, Busani again, hosted Mazzucato. And I think this is the beginning of us trying to look at alternatives. So in conclusion, I think that's where the debate should go for us, for economists, is about a macroeconomic model that can give us at least 5% growth going forward. Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you very much, Lumkile, for your concluding comments. Thank you for also operating in an informal settlement there where you are, but connectivity helps. Martin, your concluding comments, and
yes,
scan the questions there and see which ones you want to zero in.
So I am watching the comments with great interest, I have to say. And I just want to make 2 or 3 points, if I may. The first is, we have to, even if we borrow more, we need to live within limited means. And that means prioritization. That is not motherhood and apple pie. We've not done that. This is a country that wants to have its cake and eat it. It's not possible. We don't have the financial wherewithal. We need to make difficult decisions, and we need to prioritize those that are most vulnerable in society. So everybody needs, it seems to me, to get that reality as soon as possible. The second is, everybody seems to accept that we have an incapable state. And yet I've seen comments suggesting the state must play a more significant role. Well, it can only play a more significant role if it is appropriately capacitated with skills, capability, and experience, and that it is held accountable. If we don't have all of those criteria in place, we're simply going to see a further progression, or I should say, degrading of the current set of circumstances. That's impossible, and therefore people have got to call that out. And by the way, at the top of that list, in my opinion, is cadre deployment and avoiding merit-based appointments. It's just as simple as that, and holding people to account. That's the second point that I want to make. And the third point that I want to make, and again, I've tried to emphasize this, Maurice, is we're in a current crisis, which is not of our making, but it's a reality. And therefore, I would suggest that we need to be cognizant of the fact that nothing that we do should put the lives at risk of those who are vulnerable in this country, and therefore that we need, as I said, to implement whatever measures are appropriate. And the best measure we know is the vaccination program. And until then, it's going to be social distancing and different forms of lockdown, as sure as night follows day. Now, we think that the entire vaccination program costs less than 15 billion rand. 15 billion rand to vaccinate the entire program. That is effectively the amount of money that has been committed to supporting SAA. That's the sort of decision that I've been talking about that we need to take urgently under the circumstances. So when I say living within our means, I mean living not just within our financial means, but optimizing all of our resources. I've seen the comments again that Neil has posted. Everybody must be held accountable. The state, the private sector, and indeed organized labor. Everybody must be held accountable accordingly, as should civil society, in the manner in which they conduct themselves. And we must ensure that we manage people's expectations, which perhaps I just want to make my final point, which is we're in for the long haul now. There are no quick fixes. We are now investing for our children's benefit, not for our own benefit, and maybe our grandchildren's benefit. So let's make sure that we do so wisely and thoughtfully, and indeed responsibly. Thank you very much, Maurice.
Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you, Neil. I can hear you. I can see you actively involved. And I'll call upon you next time that we discuss a little bit more. Your concluding comment, Babnen.
Thank you again, Maurice. I don't think I have much to say other than to say that all we need to do now is to pick up the low-hanging fruit before it rots.
Yeah.
No more new plans.
Yeah.
Old plans are adequate, and they all of them have not missed what the challenges are, and all of them have also not missed what their solutions are. If only we were to wake up and actually implement all of them. If we were to prioritize them, as Martin says, so be it, because the resources might not be adequate for us to implement all of our policy positions. But it is time that when we talk economic reforms, we actually are very clear as to what it is we're talking about, and we all actively take part in making sure that we implement whatever we put forward as our solutions, because you will never know if those solutions work unless you put them on trial. So all we need to do is to make, and also be simplistic in our approach, because I think we get too sophisticated at times for problems that are staring us in the eye of poverty, of inequality, of unemployment, when we could actually be adopting straightforward and simple solutions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nene. And my concluding comments is that we as business schools or academia needs to really focus and think through this question of building capable state. And then obviously cadre deployment must just be out of the window, and be real clear about the skills audit of the state and be able to contribute in a meaningful way. So I'm inviting you as panelists, come and interact with me in an informal way. We'll arrange that so that we can focus on one area and tackle it, because we've got the competence and the expertise and the resources to focus in that area. And when Lumkile has already mentioned it, so I'm committing the business school to that kind of action. Let me thank everyone who's participated, and the engagement has been very good. Let me tell you again, continue with this debate and conversation, because post-COVID economic recovery is essential. And it's very, very, very important for us to do that. And we all hands must be on deck. And I don't want us to have this defeatist attitude of saying government must do all these things. We need to all engage. We need to be involved. And we are quite happy at business school here to promote a lot of engagements outside the webinars, but in that will be focusing on coming with concrete solutions and proposals. So thank you, my panelists. You've really done a great job. Well done. And I'd like to thank all my technical team and the marketing team. And again, we're going to Easter time. Please stay safe and healthy. Continue wearing your mask, continue social distancing, and continue making sure that you wash your hands. And let's not have this self-fulfilling prophecy that the third wave is coming. We can stop it. It's within our hands. And I don't want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you very much. Everything that we wanted to do has been done now. Travel safely. God bless you. Thank you. Martin Deakin.